This episode of BiCurean, we are joined by Vanessa Otero of Adfontes Media. Catching up since our first chat with her, we learned about their new podcast review process, their media literacy curricula, and much more.
Are you daydreaming about putting tiny homes on a piece of land with your best friends? Excited about the idea of buying an apartment building or a big house to live in with your non-traditional family? Curious about buying but feel totally overwhelmed? I want to help. My name is Sarah Wells, and I'm a realtor with Live Work Denver, specializing in co-buying and community housing. I love working with buyers to help them realize their dreams of shared housing and helping groups of people get a foothold in owning their homes by working together. Get in touch at liveworkdenver.com and let's start talking about how to make your housing plans a reality. That's liveworkdenver.com for resources and next steps on making your shared housing dreams come true.
Hi, I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla.
And together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society, we explore multiple ways of looking at things.
Welcome to the show.
It's so good to be back. I love spring.
It is spring, although at the time of recording this, it has been snowing here in Colorado. Just one last spring snowstorm.
Yeah,
So,
you can't really say it's not spring in Colorado because of something like weather.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think so anyway.
No, it's true.
So we are, I would say giddy. I'm giddy. I guess I shouldn't speak for you about our guest today.
I'm pretty excited.
I'm giddy. You're excited. Okay. And I'll let you do the honors.
Well, so, and we've had Vanessa Otero on before, but we're having her back. Vanessa, can you reintroduce yourself to our audience and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Vanessa Otero. I'm the founder and CEO of Adfontes Media, and you may know us best for being the producers of the media bias chart that you've seen floating around online for the last few years.
Yeah, that's how we found you, and I was thrilled when we found you because that, to me, became a defining thing of the 2016 election cycle and even the few years since then. To really be aware because of all of the claims of fake news and all of this stuff, which never, ever really stopped until that particular person making those claims left office. But I just found myself really appreciating even just that somebody was actually paying attention to that, because you hear about it. Mostly you hear about it from the news organizations talking about the other news organizations. So
Right.
That other guy, you got to watch that guy. So, yeah. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to that episode, it's called Nutritious News. And we had a great conversation with Vanessa. We'll link to it. And you can learn all about the ways in which she recommended getting healthy around your news intake. Which was a great concept.
But first things first, we have a question for you. And
Yeah.
it's what we're asking all of our current guests on the last couple of shows that we've done. But what does BiCurean mean to you?
Well, I love etymology, and I studied Latin when I was in middle school and high school. And Epicurean is a Greek word, right? But I was an English major. Adfontes is Latin for to the source. So so obviously, it sounds like bi-curious, and then it's Epicurean. So there's all three of those things in there. And I know, balanced political discourse is a part of what the podcast is all about. So, seeing both sides, being curious about both sides, a little allusion to sexuality, and an allusion to philosophy, Epicurean philosophy. So that's, all of it. It means all of that to me.
Aisla studied a lot of Latin too. So yeah, I think you just made her day.
Yeah, no, that is actually where it came from, was the combination of that bi-curious and Epicurean, that the philosophy of Epicureanism of being into the sensation of life. And so that passion for your belief, that passion for your opinion, because one of the things that Eric and I really believe in is that civil discourse doesn't have to be like quiet. You can have a feeling. You can even have a reaction. You can get upset. You just don't dehumanize the other person. And you don't decide that because they believe something that you don't believe, that somehow that you know something else about them. You just keep asking and listening. And you don't even have to get to a point where you agree. Just be respectful and try to understand. And so that's part of it too, is that passion of saying we are going to be here and we're going to have our opinions and they're going to be strong. And sometimes we might even get heated. And we're never going to say anything dehumanizing about each other or another person, even no matter how heated we get. And we'll apologize when we say something that somebody has a problem with. And that's, I like to say, we make news boring again. There's clickbait. We're like anti-clickbait. And then the other thing is to like dig in under those rhetorical reactions that everybody has. So we did an episode on guns early on, and I just reposted it because of the recent local tragedies. And one of the things that I pointed out is like, I am not pro-gun and I am not pro-gun control. I am anti-slaughter. And that's where I want to have the conversation, because we've had the other conversation so much, people already know what they're going to say. So let's step away from that and actually talk to each other, because I think we're all really clear that part is terrible, regardless of the rest of it.
Right.
So,
no, everyone wants to be safe. We do have that in common. It's just different approaches about what that means.
Exactly. And so, yeah, it's exactly that. It's that philosophy of being in it and passionate and in life. And then also trying to find those places where the things that look like they are against each other can meet. And he's not wrong. I was a comparative literature major and studied Greek and Latin and all of that. And it just perked my ears up. When you said etymology, I was like, oh my gosh, you're my best friend.
We're nerds.
Yep.
Oh, I loved your answer. Thank you.
Me too.
So what have you been up to? Because we reached out, we touched base, and you had a list.
Yeah, a lot of things. So, my whole company started as a project initially with a media bias chart I created. I was working as a patent attorney at the time. I've been a licensed patent attorney for almost 7 years now, practiced for 6. I left my practice last year because, I wanted to grow Adfontes Media. So we started as an actual company about 3 years ago, and we started that in response to people asking for more things related to the media bias chart. They would ask specifically for our underlying methodology, our data to support our ratings, and for more news sources. That was always a thing, like, can you please rate this news source and this news source? Because there's just thousands of them out there. And there's a huge need and a business opportunity there, because there are, as I like to say, there are a lot of good stakeholders in good news media. And what all of them need are news ratings, like ratings for reliability and bias. And we didn't really ever have that before. It's sort of a new thing. It's a new field. But now it's not just my company that's doing this. There are a few other companies in the space rating for either reliability or bias, usually, just because now we understand that with thousands and thousands of news and information sources out there, everything from like really reputable news sources that have been around for a long time to some new blog or somebody just posting something on social media. We just have so many different news sources. So I created a company around that. So short version of what we've been up to in the last, let's say, year or so is, we're a public benefit corporation, which means we're a for-profit company with a mission to serve the public. And our public mission is to make news consumers smarter and news media better. And the reason we're for-profit is because we need to be sustainable in order to grow to the size of the challenge. And the challenge is to be able to rate all of the news content that's out there, websites, print, TV, podcasts, all of that. And so then there are needs for the kind of data that we're putting out there in the world. And that's why we're structured the way we are. So we currently have, we added more analysts. We currently have 40 paid, part-time, full-time analysts, and they're balanced right, left, center. And they rate news articles, podcasts, and TV shows all day, every day. We've got hundreds of web print sources rated, over 150 podcasts rated. We'll be releasing new TV ratings soon. We've got over 150 TV news shows rated. And we, in order to accomplish that, we did a crowdfunding, equity crowdfunding round recently. So between the end of 2020 and the beginning of this year, we raised about $360,000 for our business, and we've got lots of folks that are now stakeholders in our business. And that's allowed us to develop products for consumers and for educators and for brands, social media platforms, publishers, which are all the different stakeholders in the news media ecosystem. So that's a short version.
I'm thrilled actually to hear about all of that stuff, and it spurred a few questions, which I will get to. Yeah. But no, I personally, like I said, I love what you're doing, and it's very inspiring to me to see that this is actually taking off. You've got a business up and running. That leads me to my first question. And this is just a kind of a gut check, I think, right? So you're for profit. What would you do if somebody like CNN showed up and said, we'd like to heavily invest in your company? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, so it all comes down to who are your stakeholders, right? And for us, it's really important to have distributed stakeholders, and we do. So we have consumers, we have educators, we have publishers, we have brands, social media companies, right? And so what they all need is a third-party independent rating system, right? So, sure, one news source could come along and say, we sell services to publishers and brands and consumers and educators, right? So does the fact that we have a particular customer that's a publisher mean that we're going to give them a better rating? Well, we could do that. We could say, oh, you give us money, we rate you better, right? But that would be a disservice to every one of our other stakeholders, like the brands, right? Like if we're not giving honest ratings and the brands can't rely on them, or the consumers can't rely on them, or the educators can't rely on them, then that's ultimately not in our best interest. So having these distributed customers and the money coming in from all different the sources, like money has to come in from somewhere, right? Everything is owned by something. And I think so often people just say, well, everything is all about the money and the ownership, like look who owns stuff. And it's not necessarily, right? It is to a certain extent, but let's look at something like News Corp, right? News Corp owns Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and New York Post, right? So those three properties, while they're all generally conservative, are very different from property to property. So it's not like just their ownership tells you the story about what's in the content. The content tells you what's in the content, right? So, whether it's you're funded by a nonprofit or one wealthy investor or self-funded or a bunch of little customers or, several large, media companies, let's say, that doesn't tell the story of, what the actual output is.
I figure you had an answer for that. I'll be transparent. And I thought it would just be good for everybody to hear from the horse's mouth in this case, how you're handling being a for-profit company doing what you guys do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think a lot of, I don't apologize for being a for-profit company.
Oh, I don't think you should, by the way.
I don't think you're asking me
I think
to
you're
either.
being very transparent, which again makes me feel very good about the product that you offer.
Yeah, I mean, you can do good and do well, right? I think a lot of folks expect the doing good work to be done for free by people who don't care about money. And I think that's really unfair, especially since what messed up our news ecosystem are a lot of folks who've made a lot of money doing it, like a lot of money messing it up. I mean, look at social media companies and brands and publishers have made a lot of money, like encouraging engagement of clickbait and a sensationalized, hyper polarizing content, right? And so should the people who come in to like clean up the mess be doing it for free. I think there's sort of this expectation in society that like, oh, just let like teachers and librarians, like who are good-hearted people, just teach the students. And, we're not going to compensate them any extra for the work that they're doing. Or we're just like going to hope some nonprofits come around and like act as good watchdogs out of the goodness of their heart. But you know what? It's tiring, it's unfair, and it's unsustainable for those organizations.
Well, and it's something I've noticed. I really agree. I worked in the nonprofit world for a long time and also had a lot of experience working with the schools. And it was interesting to me because one of the school systems I was working with, they stopped funding the diversity and inclusion portion of their staff and curriculum, and they were like, yeah, everyone else will just like take up what needs to be done, and it'll be. And I was like, one, that requires training. Two, what you pay for shows what you value. You would not fire your bookkeeper and be like, everybody else will just do the accounting because your books matter and they have to be done correctly or there's a bad consequence. And the same thing with like diversity and inclusion. But for some reason, like you said, there's this thing that like, oh, we'll just clean it up for free magically somehow. There's elves, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and people would like gladly have us do this for free. Like,
yeah.
But and we do we know that there are folks without resources, and it's really important that they have access to these resources. So we provide a lot of consumer resources on our website for free, and we provide a lot of education resources for free as well. So we have, we sell we sell media literacy education programs. We our charts we sell licenses to those, and they're used in classrooms. But we say right on there, look, if you don't have a budget for this, email us and we'll help you. So it's important to keep that balance. But if we just do it all for free, then like we won't exist. So I know people want us to exist.
Yeah, no, I think you do get what you pay for, unfortunately, in a lot of these cases. And it costs money, like you said. Having 40 people that are chosen that have their own, like slant on things, but to combine that all and pull the data that you do, I think that's important. And it's just not free. Like we don't live in that kind of a world.
Right. And, our analysts, getting back to the what you were saying about having opinions and like robust discussion, like where you can disagree, our analysts are such a great example of that. So the way we do our ratings of news sources is that we rate samples of articles or episodes of the overall news source. And so for each article or each episode, we have 3 analysts looking at that one piece of content, and they look at it together on a shift in Zoom live. So you got left, right, and center folks on there. They'll read an article, they'll rate it, they'll see each other's scores, and if there's differences, they'll discuss them. And then they'll, sometimes a lot of times they'll just like agree right away just because they're just really well trained in our methodology, and the article is straightforward. But not all articles are straightforward, and some of them have really big bias issues, and people just see them differently initially. So even on some of the most polarizing topics like guns or abortion or race, it's not like it's not hard to talk about. It is hard to talk about, but when these analysts are looking at a particular article, they're able to respectfully talk to each other and say, well, this is a sentence that I saw that made it seem that it was more left biased or more right biased. And they can talk about it through the lens of the article. And they come to just remarkable levels of agreement on how reliable something is and how biased something is. And it's just it's a example that gives me a lot of hope for how discourse can be in our country, because they get along really well. They again come to these great levels of agreement. It's not like it's always easy. Sometimes it's hard, but it's a really inspiring thing to see.
That actually, thank you for sharing that, because it is. I actually genuinely believe that if people, that's why we do this, that if we could talk more and actually listen, not that we would agree. I don't think there's going to be some kumbaya moment. We're all going to have our opinions. And I think if we were working together instead of working against each other, we'd see things being a little bit more manageable. And I don't know, because it's just not, it's never as extreme as it's presented. Like when I think about like border security, like and we interviewed the gentleman from a group called More in Common. They do a lot of studies on polarization,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing is that the reality is everybody in the country is, for the most part, obviously there's always exceptions, feels like we need some border security and we need to improve our system.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually a belief held by people regardless of ideology. They hold both beliefs. They focus on one or the other to an extreme in public
Mm-hmm.
discourse based on ideology. But it's not where they live. So if you can meet
Right.
them where they live, we'd actually maybe have some more successful conversations. And it sounds like you're providing a platform for that. And then we get to benefit from it because we get to see
Right.
the ratings.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's other ways that we like try to bring this to folks. So, our media literacy education for students and adults is really, it's designed for this exactly. So, one of the things we offer is media literacy education, but it's not important only in schools themselves, because there are lots of folks who have been out of school for a long time that still would like some help navigating the news landscape. I mean, the thing that we hear so often is, how do I know what to trust? It's a really different news landscape than it was 20 years ago. There's just like thousands and thousands and thousands of sources. And a lot of people just throw up their hands in frustration or apathy, and they'll say things like, well, they're all liars, or you can't believe anything that you hear. And you can't really truthfully operate like that. You have to have a sort of decision on whether you believe something that's presented to you or not. And we need to learn how to be cognizant of that. So, we have our courses for lifelong learners, like for adults, they're popular. I teach a seminar every week for our lifelong learners, and we go over current event news articles, and we'll look at stuff from left, right, center, high reliability, opinion content, fake news. We'll look at it all and just examine the news through that lens and learn how to rate it ourselves. And so just the practice of seeing articles from across the spectrum is really eye-opening for adult learners. And it's the same, that's what we structure our school education around too, is, we have this media bias chart, and like the astute students will say, well, how do we know that that chart itself is not biased? Which is a great question, because they need to be like critically thinking themselves. And it's great for us to tell them, but it's way better for them to be able to discern stuff themselves. I mean, ultimately, there's always going to be new news sources. They have to be able to evaluate the content. And so we teach them our methodology, and they can create their own media bias chart by rating their own articles. So that we find is like really engaging for students, because they can have these kind of discussions, and they can be talking about something very specific. Like when you get really vague in general and you say like saying something like, well, CNN is good or bad or left or middle or whatever. That's just, CNN is like so many articles, it's so many shows, it's so many things, right? But if you're talking about like one particular article, then people can come to agreement on certain facts.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important point.
Well, and critical thinking is really kind of the basis of our show. Like, that's really what we're really trying to do, which is create a world where people will pause for a second, and instead of going off their first reaction. And and it sounds like that's what you're really actually educating people to do around the media. And I mean, it's right in line with everything we're doing here philosophically. But I think you've packaged it in a very nice way from what I've seen. I did want to ask, we didn't talk to you. We talked to you kind of mid-term in the last presidency, and then we've just been through this last one. I have my own opinions on how much fake news, like the actual fake news, like oddball articles and stuff that seemed to dominate things in 2016. What did you notice about this cycle? Was it better, worse, different in general?
This election cycle?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we're sort of at this we're at this stage where now we just polarize everything. Like, that wasn't necessarily the case leading up to 2016. I think people started to really pay attention to like every news story about everything would just get polarized. But like if you go back to late 2019, early 2020, like right before the pandemic, you could see really interesting patterns emerge about like what we would polarize. Like when I wrote an article about how we polarize the pandemic, we polarize like coronavirus itself. And typically it's harder to polarize something that's complex because, and you think that something like a virus has a lot of facts around it, right? And the reporting about the coronavirus, when it was not in the United States yet, tended to be just a lot more fact-based, right? Like it was in China, and they're like, the reporting's like, there's a virus in China. This many people have caught it. These are the symptoms that happen. There was this lockdown. This is how many people have died. This is how fast it seems to be spreading. This is what the WHO thinks about it, right? All these facts, and it wasn't politicized yet because it wasn't here. And then it moved to Italy, and I was like, oh no, look at what's happening in Italy. Again, fact about what was known about coronavirus. Then it came here, right? And our president at the time, a very polarizing figure, took a side on it, right? And so it was, and the side was like, it's not that bad. Like
if I let that ship dock, we'd increase our total number by 12, and that would be insane. It was. I remember hearing him say that, and it was shocking because it's like, I don't think that's what's going to prevent this from coming in.
Right. So it really quickly turned when Americans wanted to like decide how to feel about it. People just kind of defaulted to their own like political camps, which is really weird. Like your position on whether COVID was going to be dangerous or not was like largely associated with your political party, which is nuts. And so then all of a sudden, like throughout the pandemic, people have been taking political positions on things that you would never imagine in the before times that you have a political position on. Like, does hydroxychloroquine work to stop COVID? There's a political divide over the belief of that, which is like, who had an opinion about hydroxychloroquine before that? It didn't even know what it does or works. And all of a sudden the Republicans are like, yeah, it works. Because our leader said so. And Democrats are like, no, it doesn't, because your leader said so. And the same thing around masks, about social distancing, about lockdowns. And, so like throughout the election, I mean, that happened all this election year, but everything else got polarized too. I mean, the coverage around the protests after George Floyd's death, the racial justice protests always get polarized, but this was just even more extreme. And even though people are trying to be more sensitive, like social media platforms trying to be more like proactive about not having misinformation spread, there are just so many purveyors of it that wanted to put it out there that it is largely uncontrolled.
Yeah. Did you have another question? Because I had a question.
No.
But it's not like a follow-up question, so.
You can ask.
I'm deviating. I'm jumping the shark. Wait, okay, so it's good? Excellent. So podcast reviews. I want to know all about that.
Yeah, podcast reviews.
We're going to be like CNN. We're going to come invest heavily in your company. No, that's not going to happen. I even want to. I'll invest emotionally 100%. I have a lot of that.
Okay, perfect. For the record, CNN is not invested heavily in our company.
But. No, I made that up.
No, it's fake news. That's totally fake news, guys.
It was a good example of, like I said, the gut check time of how do you handle it if somebody wants to get a better rating.
Yeah. So podcasts, and we had an opportunity come up at the end of the last year as we were exploring this, brand safety space. So just for folks that are not familiar with like the brand safety conversation, I mean, the general idea is that like now brands don't want to be seen supporting stuff that doesn't really align with their values. And by supporting, like having their ads run next to content that's objectionable in some way. And this can be like really specific to a brand. Like, if you are Burger King, you don't want your ad running next to a story about E. coli poisoning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're an airline, you don't want your story running next to a story about a plane crash, right? So, but there's like a broad categories of brand safety, like you don't want to sponsor porn or hate speech, or like your references to illicit drugs or things like that. And, that's somewhat, there's some technology for helping brands avoid that. But there hasn't been any really good technology for helping brands avoid junk news and fake news and highly polarizing content, because it just hasn't been classified the way that we classify it before. And people are really hesitant to like make those calls. They're like, well, how do we know if it's fake news? Is it just a matter of opinion? And this is kind of our wheelhouse. This is what we live in, right? Just rating the news all the time. And that's why we have like brand safety products for marketers in the news, so they can support good journalism, make sure they're not like defunding good journalism, but they can make sure they avoid fake news peddlers and stop monetizing them, because it's really easy to monetize fake news if the brands aren't paying attention. So that's really it's hard to do it on the web. It's way harder to do in podcasts, because you got to listen to all the dang podcasts. And there are 2 million podcasts on Apple iTunes right now, and all the different platforms. So and some of them are really, really extremely popular. And so, if you have a popular podcast, people are like, oh, look, this audience of podcast listeners is very engaged. Podcast advertising is like pretty hot, because it's harder for them to like fast forward through the ads, and the hosts read them, and people have like this connection. They all of a sudden love their like podcast advertisers written by their read out by their podcast hosts. But some of those very, very, very popular podcasts are like heavily spreading, lies, racism, like hate speech, election disinformation, COVID disinformation, right? So it's not enough to just say, well, this podcast is popular, I'm going to advertise on it. It's important to have these ratings so like what's acceptable or not, because every once in a while that'll get a brand in trouble. The host goes off the deep end and says something like really inflammatory. All of a sudden, people are boycotting your brand on Twitter. Your employees are mad at you as a company. And so, we decided to get into podcast ratings because we had, a partner, like an ad agency that we work with called Oxford Road. They started this initiative called the Media Roundtable about civility and truth and civility in journalism. And they really care about this issue very much. So now we've started rating podcasts. Our wonderful analysts sit there and listen to them together, and left, right, center, up and down. It's very much like the web media landscape. So we've got like I said, about 150 podcasts rated. We only have like small samples out there available publicly, just because it is a product for us. But we'll be adding more and more free resources as we go along.
I mean, again, it all makes sense to me. It does. I appreciate what you're doing, and I think you brought up a good point. Like, it's easy to say this guy is super popular, but I mean, how many of these people? Maybe if you're thinking about advertising, you watch a few of their YouTube shows or their podcast or whatever, and actually, get a feel for them and stuff. But it sounds like you're doing much more in-depth work. Yeah.
But brands can't. Like, brands cannot spend that much time listening to podcasts
to find
like,
the right market. Assuming
right, if they're going to advertise on 500 podcasts, and they just make buys like that, right? Yeah. They can't listen to 500 to get a sense of it. Their ads just run. They go through the agencies, and the ads just run. They're like, these ads have this demographic. Go.
So, and this would go with the podcast, but also all the media sources. Are you still doing a lot of stuff to compare, journalism versus editorialism and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's we always rate all the content for a particular outlet, and we make our own classifications for whether it's news or opinion, but it's more complicated than a news versus opinion binary. People say like, oh, well, do you separate out news versus opinion. And we do, but like we do way more than that, because from the top to the bottom, it's like, original fact reporting, complex analysis, opinion, selective or misleading. So even that top category is like 5 different gradients of like what we call expression. So, analysis falls at somewhere in between opinion and fact reporting. And there are certain factors that make something more like analysis or more like opinion or worse than opinion. So it's a whole gradient. So when we rate something like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, they have their opinion sectioned off, right? But people's impression of how biased that particular source is often driven by the coverage in their opinion sections. Because if you are just scrolling on Twitter and you see one article from the Wall Street Journal and it's a right-leaning opinion article, you're like, well, Wall Street Journal is right-leaning biased. If you see a left-leaning opinion article from New York Times is left-leaning biased, right? So we include all of those in our sample. And we do that especially because other outlets don't necessarily label stuff as news or opinion,
Yeah.
Vox and Slate, like it's sort of all like analysis and commentary, right? And it's not necessarily labeled as like, well, this one's news and this one's opinion. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of why I was asking, just because I think a lot of people have mixed their journalism with their opinion in such a way. Like you said, it's not the editorial pages and then here's what happened today in the news
Right.
on many sources.
Well, I have my own internal media bias check, although I use your chart too, where if I read something and it's something I agree with, I'm like, so I see an article about a politician that I dislike and it really feels good. I'm like, I better go research that. If I immediately feel excited and, or if I immediately feel defensive, I'm like, I better go research that. Because I have learned that my feelings about it are a great indication of whether or not I'm actually paying attention to what's happening, or I'm just interested in making myself feel like I'm on the right team, quote unquote.
That's a great practice, and people should do more of that, right? Now, we tend to do the opposite. And so if you read something about somebody that you like and it's bad, you're like, hey, that's probably not true because of X, Y, and Z. And then you're more skeptical of it, right? But if it's on your own side and it makes you feel good, you tend to just not be skeptical of it. So that's like a really good practice to like make yourself do that when something is like highly bias confirming. And that kind of helps. That's why having the multiple analysts in one shift really helps, because if you're going to naturally be more skeptical of the other side. So you need at least one person in there to be skeptical of it so they can go find the other information that might debunk it, right?
Yep.
You keep on using the word rating. And I know that for you, you're talking about rating them based on their bias, and these various different factors. But I can't help but have it pop into my head every time you say that to think about ratings.
Right.
As in, I feel like, one of the major things here to consider is entertainment value. I mean, I almost feel like Fox News and MSNBC are the equivalent of shock jock radio DJs at this point. They're pulling that sort of thing, and they are fighting over. And we had a little brief discussion about like rating shifts since Trump left office and things like that. Pardon me. How has that kind of gotten into the work that you're doing? Like just taking that, how would you even account for that? Because I do feel like there's a certain amount of, I watched Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. It's educational, but it's entertaining, and it's definitely biased. And I have no illusions about that. What do other people think about this ratings grab type mentality?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that the cable news is all about it's mostly analysis and opinion. And we talked about this on our last episode. How it's like it's like junk food. It's like the donuts and fries of the news landscape, and it's like, it's like donuts and fries are food, but you shouldn't just eat those. It's bad for you. Like MSNBC, CNN, Fox, they're news, but not like fact-based, like highly factual, lots of information type of news. It's like, here's a story and here's a bunch of opinions and analysis about that story. So you can watch, those cable news shows for hours in the afternoon and only hear about like maybe 4 different stories. that's popular. People like analysis and opinion, and they think that it's news. It's also, business model wise, much less expensive to produce than actual, journalists, journalists on beats, like calling people and looking at primary sources and like doing the work of journalists. Right. So for your question about ratings, yes, like we're talking about content ratings in the sense of like how like movies are rated, G and PG-13 and R. Those are content ratings. Like we're doing content ratings of news as opposed to like, audience metric ratings. And there have been certainly shifts in how cable news, gets better audience ratings, better and worse audience ratings, especially since Trump left office. And I think there's a lot that's been made of like, oh, well, the media just wants Trump in office because it's really good for them because a lot of people watch and tune in. But you know what? Things normalize. People watch news. There may be like shifts here and there, and outlets may try to grab certain audiences when they see an opportunity. For example, after the election, OAN and Newsmax saw an opportunity to grab some audience share from Fox because, some people wanted to hear that, yeah, there was a bunch of election fraud and the election was stolen from Trump, even though it wasn't true. And they would run with that and try to grab people away from Fox who are saying, that's not what you want to hear, but there was no election fraud, right?
Yeah. Well, so that's interesting. Do you guys present things almost on like a time lapse? Is this a chart, a bar graph that shows like, oh, these guys have shifted way farther down, but maybe to attain ratings or whatever they were trying to do?
Yeah, there was a pretty notable shift, like with like Newsmax and OAN in particular, because there's certain news sources that kind of have like a large spread on our chart of reliability, where like the stuff that has lower ratings tends to be like they have some okay stuff, like perfectly fine news, and some like a lot of opinion content, and then occasional disinformation, which is like not a good spread because you should not have occasional disinformation on any news source, but some of them do. And then so OAN and Fox Newsmax were kind of in the same area for a while, but then for a period of time, they just went in a lot of stories about election fraud that just weren't true or were highly misleading. And so that did drop their rating over time. You could see that shift. Now we're implementing like time lapse things so you can like see over time a source move. And as we get more ratings and as news cycles change, you'll be able to see that more clearly over a longer period of time. So we're excited for that. People have asked us for that for a long time, and we're pretty close to being able to implement that.
Yeah, no, I love that idea. Again, just being able to see how things shifted, like I haven't spent a lot of time personally on Fox News or anything like that, but it does seem like
you're always making me watch that.
I do flip back and forth.
He really does.
I do try to just
we should see what they're looking at. And I'm like, why are you
what are they looking
at?
Well, so and so is covering this. What's Fox News covering right now? But it does seem like, I mean, their whole source of food like went away without having a daily Trump thing to talk about, whether, so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's always new things to polarize, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can talk about like how Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head like are being canceled, right? And there's always outrage to be generated. And some outlets are in the business of that outrage generation, unfortunately. But it is a good practice. I know you hate it, Aisla, but it's important to see stuff from the other side, and most people just don't do it. Like it's because it's viscerally uncomfortable. Like one thing I have to train our analysts on at the very beginning when they first start listening, especially to TV shows and podcasts, which like you can tell the tone and you hear the like invective, like the venom that people say certain words with. It actually like hurts your soul a little bit to watch something that you just disagree with so much, and that like wears off after time. But it's really important for understanding how people that think differently from you think, and it's the more you can kind of live in that world and understand like why people say the things they say, the more effective you can be at possibly convincing them of your point of view.
That should be your tagline: watching fake news so you don't have to.
There we go. I like that.
Yep.
Well, and for me, it's also just I have a hard, what you were saying, the words. I noticed we watched the, I will call it an insurrection at the Capitol. And I was watching I was watching like I think CBS and coverage. And then it was like just so emotional. And then we switched to the C-SPAN where they were just showing them doing the voting. And all of a sudden my anxiety level like dropped completely, even though it was still obviously very upsetting. I realized like, oh, the CBS people, while I think they were appropriately reporting, they were still making a lot of like heavy emotional comments about it that were moving me towards an opinion that may or may not have been.
I mean, all they have to do is say the words like, "This is frightening."
Yeah, and
maybe
and
they're personally frightened as like a person on the ground there, but then you're just getting that empathically, right?
And so then to move to like just the C-SPAN, and I was like, oh, this is why I shouldn't watch CNN or Fox, because I am really affected by that. I do much better with like original source material and reading things. That's where I can like land. But I joke about it, but I do appreciate that he has that commitment, because obviously we're doing this show together, so it's nice to know that he practices what he preaches on the airwaves.
Yeah, and it's really it is hard to do, and ideally you want to be watching or like just taking in just the facts, like making the news boring as much as possible, because you can formulate your own conclusions about what it means.
Right.
But it's also very easy to allow other people to formulate opinions about what it means without even realizing it. And so many people I just get locked into that. They're like, well, I'm watching the news, like, and this is truly how I feel. And is it really truly how you would feel if you just came to those, you just saw those facts reported by themselves? One thing I thought was interesting, like, and this is another reason we don't, we categorize news analysis and opinion on our own, is because sometimes things are labeled opinion that are not necessarily opinion, right? So I read it was labeled as an opinion article in the New York Times once, and it was a story of a person, like a mother with her child who had crossed the border, right? And like sentence after sentence was like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, like, about this mother and child. But to me, it was heart-wrenching, because it was like she fled this kind of abuse in her home country. She traveled this many miles. Her child is 6 years old. When she crossed the border, she was separated from her child for this many days, right? And like there was really no opinion in that. But because like I came to the conclusion, like, this is a horrible thing to happen to a human, right? That doesn't make, like, just because I had a feeling about that situation doesn't mean that that's like an opinion column, right? So that's kind of like the opposite example. But most, especially cable news and a lot of analysis and opinion content that we consume on some of our favorite partisan websites is presented just like, this is how you should feel about it. I mean, the opposite of the insurrection, coverage on like CNN would be like, you go over to Newsmax, they weren't even showing that day. I flipped over to Newsmax. I was like, I got to see what they're covering. Wasn't even like live footage of what was happening there. They're like, people are freaking out because there's maybe like 50 people, walking in the middle of 50 unarmed guys strolling around the Capitol. It's like, no big deal at all. That's how they characterize it. And if that was the only thing you were watching, you wouldn't know any different.
Yep.
And it's dangerous levels of misinformation at that point. I mean, that I think people should at least respect their minds and themselves enough to try to get a clear view of what's going on. And if you just don't, I mean, I know people that were like, I had to turn off the TV. It was too much. Fine. That's who you are. That's what's happening. But I mean, yeah, it felt important during that. I did the same thing, just flipped between a bunch of different things specifically because I wanted to see what the whole picture really looked like, even from biased points of view that I was acknowledging.
And I leaned on your texts so I could just stay on CBS. It was like, thank you for sharing what's happening everywhere else. So I wanted to also really quick hear a little bit more, whatever we can, about your media literacy program. It's in both. I saw that you had a partnership, and also you said you have products and seminars. I don't know. Hopefully we can get some links from you for how people can get signed up. because obviously, I mean, I was going to say, I am so excited that you're doing this. I think that, ultimately we can't change the way it is. We've got people out there who are doing different kinds of news that is not really news. And this seems like the only genuinely practical approach, which is to say, okay, we know it's going to be out there. We need to give people the tools to identify so they can make informed decisions. And I'm so grateful that you came up with these ideas and that you're making this happen. I think it's really one of the few things that gives me hope about how we can go forward more effectively. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much. I'd be happy to plug our stuff because it's really, they're really tools for people to, take things into their own hands about like their own media literacy and for schools, for educators. So we have a whole educational program called our SUMA News Literacy Program. And it's a collection of digital lessons, text and video that teach students and teachers about our methodology for rating news sources. So you can read an article, you rate it for reliability and bias, and it's also access to our software platform that our analysts use for making those ratings. Because we have little software to enter articles and make our ratings on them and save them and store them, and then teachers can see them. And at the end of a month or a semester, you can see your whole media bias chart that your class has made based on their own ratings. And it's a great way to see current events, because every week we put in a bunch of articles from that week's events that teachers and students can go and rate together. Learn about politics at the same time. So we make that available for schools. You can get that on our site. Whether it's just at a classroom level or like a department level or whole school. And we're available through a distributor as well called Mackin. It's a K through 12 distributor of education if your school already uses that. Now, for adults, we provide these news literacy lessons as part of our membership. So we have a couple memberships at like roughly $10 a month or $18 a month, and you can take these same lessons. And I do a live session, and one of my analysts does another live session every week, and it's like an 8-week course. And you do it self-paced or live or a little bit of both, and you can do it as often as you want for as long as you're a member. Now we recently partnered with we formed a strategic alliance with Media Literacy Now, because it's a nonprofit organization whose work we think is really important and we want to support. So they're a nonprofit, politically neutral advocacy group that's all about promoting media literacy in schools, so in K through 12 education. And they've done lots of great work over the last 10 years. They have state chapters all across the country. Have been just very effective in promoting this concept, and you see media literacy curricula in more schools as a result. So by being a member on our site, 10% of membership dollars goes towards media literacy now to support the work that they do, because we just really believe in their mission, and we think media literacy should be in schools.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. Look, I'm gonna editorial mode on. I wish we didn't need a service like this. I mean, I wish there wasn't a need for you to have a for-profit, nonprofit company or whatever. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that we're in a world where, just the idea of the news we consume being so biased or, designed to affect our opinions and things like that is almost a scary thought. So, by saying that, I'm saying thank you and keep up the good work, because I think it's more important than ever to have the services of what you guys are doing.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'll give you like an optimistic take on this. So, we have more information available at our fingertips than ever before, because of social media and because of the internet. And this has happened in our past, over history before, where we all of a sudden have access to more information, like when the printing press came out, right? Or like world trade with and channels of communication opened up, like TV and radio, right? And each time we kind of had to go through this learning curve of like how to deal with all this information. And this is just the biggest learning curve we've had to deal with as a society, because it's the most information we've all had access to. So we're going through these growing pains, but ultimately, like more people's access to more information is a net benefit. but we're just really in the midst of the growing pains right now. So we need to learn how to deal with this much information. And it's like learning to be literate as a society, right? Before, people just couldn't read because there were no books, didn't matter, right? And then all of a sudden you have to like teach generations and societies how to read. And how'd you do that? Well, with schools. And it just became important for everybody to be able to read. And just like you can go from illiterate to literate in a generation or two if it's taught, you can go from media or information illiterate to media and information literate in a generation or two as long as it's taught. So that's what we're doing. And then eventually people will be like, oh yeah, we know how to discern information for ourselves, and then we won't need something like this.
Well, and again, we've had a few people on that I feel like are really in line with what our show is about, the way that we think. I mean, you used my favorite 2 words in a row: critical thinking. And I love it.
And etymology.
And
like, I
yes,
mean,
that's another one.
I know.
But I mean, we talk about a lot of subjects. We talk to a lot of people, but what you're doing is in line with our philosophical basis of this show, which is just to get people to pay attention, think critically, formulate their own opinion instead of being told by anyone else what's happening. But you've got to do work for that. And I do think what you're doing is offering people the ability to learn how to do the work themselves, but also offering a little bit of a quick check. Maybe it's worth noting, oh yeah, Newsmax is as bad as ever today. So anyway, great having you on the show. We really appreciate it. We'll be in touch. We'll have all of these links that we discussed in our show notes, and I look forward to having you back again sooner than later to hear where it's going next.
Yeah, no, I really love catching up with you and hearing what you're creating out there. It's, like I said, it's one of those moments of hope, and I appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, it was really great being on with you. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to talk about this anytime.
Thanks. And thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, or thoughts that you want to share with us, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can email podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we're doing, please rate us on your favorite listening platform of choice.
Thank you.